The handcuffs bit into Marcus's wrists tighter with every step. Officer Harkins grinned, dragging him across the police station like a trophy. Whispers filled the room, a young black man arrested for sitting on a bench. No threats, no resistance, just skin color. But as they pulled Marcus through the back corridors, a senior officer's face turned pale. Someone sprinted to the captain's office. Within minutes, the building would crack open under the weight of one irreversible mistake. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The late afternoon sun dipped low over Riverside Park, bathing the benches in gold. Marcus Davis sat alone, a closed leather-bound book resting on his knees, the breeze flipping its pages gently. His dark hoodie and jeans blended him into the calm scenery, or should have. Across the lawn, Officer Brian Harkins paused mid-patrol. He shifted his weight, scrutinizing the solitary figure. A young black man, alone, looking too comfortable. Never seen him before, muttered Brian under his breath. Something about Marcus irked him, the ease, the serenity. Brian's gut twisted, a sensation he'd long ago learned to trust without question. Slowly, deliberately, he crossed the grass. Marcus lifted his gaze from the book. He felt the stare, heavy and unblinking, long before he saw the badge. His pulse quickened, but his expression remained composed. Not today. Not again. Afternoon, Officer Harkins said, his voice coated in false politeness. Afternoon, Marcus replied evenly, making sure his hands stayed visible. The officer's eyes darted to the book, then back to Marcus's face. What brings you here today? Marcus offered a half-smile. Just enjoying the weather. A muscle in Brian's jaw twitched. Got some ID on you? Marcus's fingers tightened slightly around the book's edges. He knew the dance. Show your ID, answer every question, smile just right, and still risk becoming a headline. Am I under arrest? He asked calmly. Brian's posture stiffened immediately. You will be if you don't start cooperating, he barked, hand resting on his holster. Around them, mothers pushed strollers and elderly couples fed ducks. No one intervened. No one even looked twice. Marcus exhaled quietly, his mind racing. Resistance would only feed the beast. He reached slowly into his back pocket, never dropping eye contact, and pulled out his wallet. Officer Harkins snatched the ID roughly, not bothering to hide the disdain curling his lip. Stand up, he ordered. Marcus hesitated. The bench creaked as he rose, keeping his movements exaggeratedly slow. His chest burned with frustration, but he masked it well. Harkins didn't see a Harvard graduate, a federal agent, a man who spent years serving his country. He just saw what he wanted to see. The cold steel of handcuffs clamped over Marcus's wrists. What's the charge? Marcus asked softly. Brian leaned close enough for Marcus to smell the coffee on his breath. Suspicion, he sneered. Suspicion of existing. Of breathing. Of being black in public. As Harkins shoved him toward the patrol car, Marcus noticed the passers-by. Some turned their heads. Most didn't. A few pulled out phones but quickly lowered them again when they caught the officer's glare. Inside the cruiser, the tightness around Marcus's chest didn't ease. He rested his forehead against the window, watching the park disappear behind him, replaced by cracked sidewalks and leaning lampposts. Brian drove fast, the sirens off but the urgency radiating from every sharp turn. He didn't speak. Neither did Marcus. Not yet. They pulled into the precinct's side entrance, away from the main lobby, away from eyes and questions. Brian yanked the door open and dragged Marcus out roughly, shoving him forward through a narrow corridor. The walls seemed to close in, yellowed paint peeling, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Marcus kept his steps measured, calm, controlled. But inside, a fuse was burning down to its final inch. The mistake had already been made, and the cost would be higher than Brian Harkins could imagine. The heavy door at the end of the hallway swung open with a metallic groan. Officer Harkins shoved Marcus inside a dimly lit holding room, the stench of old coffee and disinfectant thick in the air. Two junior officers glanced up from their desks, momentarily puzzled. Marcus met their curious stares head-on, offering no explanation. Brian slapped Marcus's ID down on the processing desk with a loud smack. Name's Marcus Davis. Acting suspicious. Possible trespassing, he said, his voice sharp and authoritative. One of the younger officers, a freckled man with Dawson stitched onto his uniform, frowned slightly as he picked up the ID. His brow furrowed almost immediately, but he said nothing. Instead, he slid the ID across the desk to his partner. Put him in holding for now. I'll get to the paperwork later, barked Brian, already turning on his heel. Marcus stood silently. The cuffs on his wrist bit into his skin, but he refused to let it show. His mind was ticking, precise, calculating, patient. Dawson hesitated. Sir, you sure about? Did I stutter? Snapped Brian without looking back. The junior officer flinched, nodding quickly. He stood and gestured awkwardly for Marcus to follow him through another door. The holding cell was small, barely larger than a janitor's closet. A narrow bench lined the wall. No windows. No clock. Only the faint hum of distant activity from the precinct beyond the door. Marcus sat down slowly, resting his cuffed hands on his lap. He allowed himself a long, steadying breath. They don't know. Not yet. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. More voices. Paperwork shuffling. And then a pause. Whispered tones. Urgent. Nervous. Marcus's ears picked up a few words. Captain's gonna flip. Wrong guy. Badge number on that ID. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the shift in the air. The dominoes had begun to tip, but the first crash was still to come. 15 minutes passed. Maybe 20. Then the door opened sharply. It wasn't Brian. It wasn't Dawson. It was Captain Elaine Monroe. Her crisp uniform radiated authority. Short-cropped silver hair framed a face hardened by decades of commanding rooms full of men who thought they knew better. She walked in like a thunderstorm, controlled but crackling. Behind her, Dawson hovered nervously, his face pale. Marcus stood, hands still cuffed. Captain Monroe's eyes locked onto him immediately. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face, recognition, dread, something deeper, before her features snapped back to professional neutrality. Mr. Davis, she said, her voice even but taut. Marcus inclined his head slightly, saying nothing. Captain Monroe turned her sharp gaze to Dawson. Get those cuffs off. Now. The young officer scrambled forward, fumbling with the key. The click of the cuffs opening echoed louder than it should have. Marcus rubbed his wrists, still silent. Captain Monroe straightened her posture. Mr. Davis, would you please come with me? Privately. No apology. No explanations. Yet, Marcus followed her out without a word, feeling Officer Dawson's wide, panicked eyes on his back the entire way. As they disappeared down the hallway, Brian Harkins emerged from around the corner, a coffee in one hand, a cocky grin on his face. He froze mid-step when he saw Marcus walking freely beside the captain. The cup slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. Marcus didn't look at him. He didn't need to. The reckoning had just begun. Captain Monroe led Marcus through a narrow side corridor, away from the open eyes of the main floor. Her polished shoes tapped rapidly against the aging tiles, the pace clipped, urgent. She stopped at a heavy oak door marked Command Office and gestured him inside. Marcus stepped over the threshold into a stark, sparsely decorated room, a large desk, 2 chairs, and a single U.S. flag drooping tiredly from the corner. The blinds were drawn tight. The captain closed the door behind them and locked it. For a moment, neither spoke. Captain Monroe folded her hands behind her back, measuring her words with surgical precision. Mr. Davis, she began, her voice low and grave. I need to confirm something before we proceed further. Marcus said nothing. He let the silence stretch, forcing her to be the one to bridge the chasm she had helped create. She cleared her throat, uneasy under the weight of it. Are you currently operating under assignment? His lips curled in the faintest smile. Not warm. Not forgiving. I was enjoying a day off, Captain, until your officer decided I was a national threat because of my skin color. Captain Monroe's shoulders stiffened at the accusation she didn't dare deny. She opened a drawer and pulled out a thick file, his personnel record. It was thinner than she expected. Marcus worked clean. Quiet. Effective. She skimmed the page with quick glances, her fingers tightening slightly as she read the clearance levels, commendations, operations he had led, all buried deep behind classifications her precinct would never legally touch. When she spoke again, her voice had lost the official tone. I'm aware now of the position you hold, Mr. Davis. If I had been informed earlier. Marcus cut her off, his voice calm but cutting. You would have ordered your men not to lay hands on me. He stepped closer, his posture relaxed but his presence filling the room. But that's the problem, Captain. It shouldn't take a badge for me to be treated like a human being. Captain Monroe dropped her gaze for half a second. A crack in the armor. Outside the locked door, hurried footsteps passed. Someone knocked once, urgently. Captain, came Officer Dawson's strained voice. You need to come see this. Now. Monroe's jaw clenched. She glanced at Marcus. Please, she said tightly. Stay here. She unlocked the door and disappeared down the hallway. Marcus leaned against the desk, arms folded loosely across his chest, listening. Shouts erupted in the lobby. Raised voices. The screech of chairs scraping across linoleum. Marcus smiled inwardly. The second domino had fallen. Through the slats of the blinds, he could see the edge of the commotion. Two sharply dressed men flashing badges, the word Bureau gleaming on their lanyards. Back up. Not for him. For the investigation about to rip through the heart of the precinct. Brian Harkins stood frozen under the fluorescent lights, his face draining of color with every passing second. One of the agents barked at him to place his hands where they could be seen. His mouth opened, some instinct to fight, to defend himself, but nothing came out. Captain Monroe reappeared moments later, her face pale but composed. She didn't ask Marcus any more questions. She didn't order. She didn't plead. She simply opened the door wider, her voice hollow. "Mr. Davis, would you like to join us?" Marcus walked past her without hesitation, stepping into a room now thrumming with panic, confusion, and the thick, bitter smell of fear. And still, not a single apology. Not yet. But it didn't matter. Marcus wasn't here for their apologies. He was here for something far more valuable. Accountability. The precinct lobby was no longer a place of order. It had become a battlefield of cold stares, whispered panic, and unspoken accusations. Marcus stood at the center of it all, arms relaxed by his sides, his calmness slicing sharper than any anger could have. The two federal agents moved with precise authority. Agent Warner, tall, severe, his gray suit immaculate, addressed the gathered officers in clipped tones. His partner, Agent Patel, younger but equally commanding, moved toward the evidence lockers, speaking rapidly into a recorder. Captain Monroe hovered behind Marcus, tension radiating from her in waves. She was boxed in loyalty to her men on one side, the unbearable weight of what they had done on the other. Officer Brian Harkins, Agent Warner barked. "You were temporarily relieved of active duty, pending an internal affairs review and federal investigation into unlawful detention and racial profiling." The words landed like a body blow. Brian stumbled back a step. "You can't do that," he rasped. "I was following procedure." Agent Warner's face didn't even flicker. "Which part of your procedure involves handcuffing a man for reading a book in a public park?" Murmurs rippled through the gathered staff. Marcus watched it unfold silently, hands clasped loosely behind his back, like a professor observing a crumbling thesis. But he knew better than to celebrate. Because then Captain Monroe stepped forward. Her voice was low but firm. "Mr. Davis," she said, choosing each word carefully, "I need to inform you that the precinct is preparing an internal report regarding today's incident, and there are concerns about your behavior during the encounter." Marcus turned his head slowly, locking eyes with her. "My behavior?" Captain Monroe's throat worked as she forced herself to continue. "Officer Harkins claims you refused lawful orders, and your presence in the park was suspicious in light of ongoing investigations in the area." Marcus didn't blink. The setup was unfolding exactly as he had expected. When they couldn't hide their mistake, they would try to muddy it, create enough doubt, sow just enough confusion, make it seem like both sides were wrong, a simple misunderstanding, so no real consequences would have to follow. Marcus allowed a brief silence to suffocate the room before he spoke. "Are you asking me to defend sitting on a public bench, Captain?" His voice was soft, but the edges were sharpened to a blade. Captain Monroe shifted uncomfortably. "No. I'm simply saying we need to gather all facts before rushing." "Facts?" Marcus interrupted, a quiet steel entering his tone. "Here's a fact. You arrested me without cause. You transported me without rights. You processed me without reason." He stepped closer, and for the first time, Captain Monroe stepped back. "And now you want to smear my name to cover your mistake." The room was deathly still. Agent Warner cleared his throat. "For the record, Mr. Davis, the Bureau has already retrieved body cam footage from Officer Harkins." He glanced toward Brian coldly. "It does not show any resistance. It shows a man calmly reading a book before being handcuffed without probable cause." Brian's face twisted with desperation. "He was looking at me like he knew something." Brian blurted, voice cracking. The room recoiled. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You mean, he was sitting while black, Captain?" No one spoke. Even Captain Monroe's mask cracked, shame flashing briefly across her face. But Marcus wasn't finished. He stepped forward once more, his voice calm but final. "I'm not here today as an agent. I'm not here with a badge to flash or a threat to make." He let his words sink in. "I'm here as a citizen whose rights were crushed under the boots of your prejudice." Captain Monroe opened her mouth, but no words came. The building felt as if it had stopped breathing. Marcus turned slowly, walking back toward the front entrance. His voice floated behind him. "I suggest you think very carefully about the next report you file, Captain, because next time it won't be a quiet visit." And with that, Marcus pushed the glass doors open and stepped into the afternoon light, free, but far from finished. He knew the real fight was only beginning. The city felt different when Marcus stepped onto the sidewalk, sharper, harder. The warm afternoon sun no longer softened the streets. Every sound, a passing car, a barking dog, the distant wail of an ambulance, felt louder, closer. Marcus moved with quiet purpose. His face calm, his mind a storm. He didn't go home. Instead, he crossed 2 blocks and entered a modest brick building tucked between a diner and a law office. A small, gold-plated sign beside the door read, "Davis and Company. Legal Consulting." He pushed inside. The reception area was empty, save for a stack of unopened mail. No secretary, no bustling phones by design. This wasn't a business built for public traffic. It was built for precision, for silence. Marcus crossed the room to a heavy, reinforced door at the back. He pressed his thumb against a biometric scanner, and the lock clicked open. Inside was a different world. A wall lined with filing cabinets. A sleek monitor bank, dark now but ready to roar to life at a moment's notice. A polished oak desk stacked with sealed case files bearing government stamps. He sat down, opened a secure laptop, and inserted a small encrypted drive from his wallet. His fingers flew across the keys. Not many people knew this side of Marcus Davis. They knew the agent. They didn't know the strategist, the man who, years ago, quietly earned a law degree at night while running operations by day. They didn't know the man who specialized in exposing corruption buried inside government structures. And they certainly didn't know he had spent the last 18 months compiling a personal database, documenting every single case of racial misconduct linked to the Riverside precinct. Officer Brian Harkins wasn't an isolated problem. He was part of a rotted system. Marcus opened a folder titled simply, Precinct 09, Internal Failures. The screen filled with names. Complaints buried. Body cam footage missing. Officers transferred quietly after excessive force incidents. Settlements paid in secret. It was all here. He pulled up Officer Harkin's internal file, redacted heavily on the surface. But Marcus had already reconstructed the missing pieces through cross-referencing court dockets, media reports, and whispered tips. 5 excessive force complaints in 12 years. 3 internal investigations all closed without discipline. 2 civilian lawsuits settled quietly out of court. 0 consequences. Marcus exhaled slowly, the anger a controlled burn behind his ribs. He opened a blank document. At the top, he typed, "Federal Civil Rights Violation Filing Riverside Police Department." Below it, he added, "Lead plaintiff, Marcus Davis." He didn't need media attention. He didn't need protests in the streets. He needed evidence. He needed precision. He needed to tear them down by the very system they had used to shield themselves. And he would. Not because he wanted revenge. Because if he let them bury this like all the others, if he let them write him off as just another misunderstanding, it would never end. Marcus leaned back in his chair for a moment, letting the weight of what was coming settle around him. This wasn't just a complaint. It was a loaded weapon. And it was aimed straight at the heart of their empire. The first email Marcus sent was clinical. No emotion. No warning. Subject, formal notice of federal civil rights violation investigation. Recipients, Captain Elaine Monroe, Riverside Precinct Legal Department, Internal Affairs Bureau. The message was short, less than 5 sentences. A notification that a federal civil rights investigation had been initiated, triggered by unlawful detainment, racial profiling, and procedural misconduct perpetrated by officers under Captain Monroe's command. No accusations. Just facts. Just enough to light the fuse. Within minutes, responses started flooding his inbox. Some were automatic. Some were panicked. Others, notably from Internal Affairs, were cold and formal, requesting clarifications and opportunities for dialogue. Marcus ignored them. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to bury. Next, he filed a formal request through a secure portal for all body cam footage from Brian Harkins for the last 90 days. Under federal law, certain types of video, once requested by a complainant, had to be preserved. No more quiet deletions or accidental malfunctions. He wasn't fishing. He already knew what he would find. Because 2 nights earlier, Marcus had seen Officer Harkins roughing up a Latino teenager 2 blocks from the same park, shouting, cursing, shoving him against a wall. No arrest. No report filed. It hadn't been an isolated incident. It was a pattern. a weapon they had used for years, and now it was turning against them. Meanwhile, across town, the walls of the Riverside precinct were already starting to crack. Captain Monroe sat rigidly at the head of the conference table, a cluster of grim-faced lawyers and nervous department heads arrayed before her. A thick file with Marcus's name sat unopened in the center. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Grayson, leaned close and whispered, "Captain, if this goes public." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Monroe's knuckles whitened against the edge of the table. "Control it," she hissed, "before it spreads." But it was already too late, because Marcus's next move wasn't a press release or a public spectacle. It was precision targeting. Within an hour, official notifications had been sent to the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, the Federal Office of Police Oversight, the State Licensing Board for Law Enforcement Certification. Each document carefully constructed, each one outlining not just Marcus's unlawful arrest, but a documented history of racial profiling patterns traced back to Riverside Precinct's internal culture, each one crafted to bypass the local system entirely. By the time Captain Monroe's lawyers finally opened the folder bearing Marcus's complaint, it wasn't just about Officer Harkins anymore. It was about systemic abuse. It was about decades of protected misconduct. It was about a cancer that now had a name. And Marcus Davis had just become the scalpel. Across the city, a clock began ticking louder, faster, toward a reckoning no cover-up could stop. And Marcus? He was just getting started. They struck back faster than Marcus anticipated. By the next morning, an anonymous report surfaced, not in newspapers, not in the national media, but slipped quietly into niche legal blogs, whispered in private listservs where reputations were shredded long before facts could catch up. The headline was surgical in its intent. Federal agent under investigation for misconduct? There were no named sources, no evidence, only heavy insinuations. Allegations of aggressive behavior during undercover operations. Questions about Marcus's temperament and fitness for duty. Hints that his record, though sealed, contained incidents of concern. The aim was clear, not to accuse him of anything outright, but to stain him just enough that his credibility would drip away before his case could even reach a courtroom. Marcus sat alone in his office, the blog post open on his screen. He didn't move, didn't blink. This was a dirty tactic, old as the system itself. Discredit the black man. Question his character. See just enough doubt. He leaned back, steepling his fingers under his chin. They weren't defending Officer Harkins anymore. They weren't protecting Captain Monroe. They were protecting the institution. And Marcus Davis had just become enemy number one. His phone buzzed, an encrypted message flashing across the locked screen. Brace for background, Wretch. They're scared. S. Warner. Agent Warner. One of the few at the bureau Marcus knew he could trust. Marcus's mouth twisted into something resembling a smile. Good. If they were scared enough to launch a smear campaign, it meant they understood something now. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't looking for a settlement. He was coming for them. And he would not stop. Marcus moved swiftly. He opened his secure drive and uploaded 3 critical files. A signed commendation from the Bureau Director for exemplary service during an international operation. A clean psychological evaluation, performed 6 months ago, signed by a senior behavioral analyst. His full service record, unedited, unsealed, showing no suspensions, no misconduct, and no disciplinary actions. He sent them all directly to the Department of Justice. Then he prepared the next phase. Because he wasn't just going to defend his name. He was going to use their smear campaign against them. At precisely noon, Marcus filed an official retaliation complaint, citing unlawful defamation by a public agency in an attempt to obstruct a federal civil rights investigation. The complaint carried teeth. Automatic escalation to federal oversight. Full forensic recovery of all emails and communications inside Riverside Precinct from the last 30 days. Mandatory deposition subpoenas for key leadership, including Captain Monroe. By launching their dirty play, they hadn't discredited Marcus. They had handed him proof of systemic corruption. Across the city, in the captain's office, Captain Monroe stared at the newest filing on her desk, her face ashen. Around her, the walls weren't just cracking anymore. They were beginning to collapse. And Marcus Davis? He wasn't stopping. Not until the whole rotten structure came down. The subpoenas hit the Riverside Precinct like a thunderclap. By 9 a.m., a federal courier delivered thick manila envelopes, each bearing the official seal of the Department of Justice. One by one, officers, lieutenants, secretaries, even Captain Monroe herself, were summoned. There would be no informal interviews, no private negotiations, only recorded depositions under oath. The corridors of the precinct once buzzed with false bravado. Now they pulsed with hushed panic. The vending machines, once gathering points for casual gossip, stood abandoned. Even the break rooms fell silent, suspicion hanging thicker than cigarette smoke. Captain Monroe sat frozen behind her desk, her hand trembling slightly as she turned over the subpoena again and again, as if the words would somehow change. "They'll eat us alive," muttered Lieutenant Grayson, pacing near the window. "This isn't an investigation anymore. It's a purge." Captain Monroe said nothing. Across the city, in the calm of his private office, Marcus watched it unfold. He didn't need media coverage. He didn't need protests. All he needed was time. And the system, the same system that had protected men like Harkins for decades, was now locked in a legal straitjacket, unable to stop what was coming. Still, Marcus knew the hardest blow had to be perfectly timed. Not too soon, not too late. Right at the moment of maximum weakness. He reviewed the collected evidence once more, building the final strike. The illegally suppressed body cam footage. Officer Harkins' falsified reports. Patterns of racial profiling backed by 27 civilian complaints, 5 whistleblower tips, and 3 settlements hidden from public records. The smear campaign emails, traced directly back to an IP address inside Captain Monroe's office. It was overwhelming, undeniable, and ready. Marcus drafted the final filing, a federal civil lawsuit for damages, not just against Officer Harkins, but against the entire command structure of Riverside Precinct for systemic violation of civil rights under color of law. It wasn't about money. It was about exposure. It was about stripping them publicly, legally, formally, until not a single promotion, not a single pension, not a single plaque on a wall could cover the rot underneath. The lawsuit would trigger mandatory external audits. It would freeze promotions. It would destroy reputations permanently. And he would be the face standing at the center when it all fell. Marcus pressed submit on the federal filing portal. The screen blinked once, twice, then confirmed. Case accepted. He closed the laptop and leaned back, exhaling a slow, measured breath. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the quiet war raging behind its polished glass and crumbling concrete. But inside Riverside Precinct, the last, thin walls were beginning to tremble. The storm Marcus Davis had unleashed was no longer coming. It was already here. The first deposition took place in a gray federal building, stripped of any grandeur. No flags, no wood-paneled courtrooms, just sterile walls, fluorescent lights, and a camera lens that recorded everything, forever. Captain Elaine Monroe sat stiffly at the center of the table, a microphone clipped to her blazer. Across from her, a federal attorney shuffled papers methodically, each movement deliberate, each pause calculated. Marcus sat in the back of the room, not as a participant, but as an observer. Silent, watchful. Captain Monroe's voice cracked slightly as she confirmed her name for the record. The questioning began, slow at first. Confirmations of rank, years of service, basic protocols. But then, like a riptide pulling her under, the real interrogation started. "Captain Monroe, were you aware of prior complaints filed against Officer Brian Harkins regarding allegations of racial profiling?" Monroe shifted uncomfortably. "Some complaints were brought to my attention, yes." "Were any disciplinary actions taken against Officer Harkins?" Monroe hesitated. "Internal reviews were conducted." "Please answer the question." "Were any disciplinary actions taken?" A long silence. Then, barely audible. "No." The federal attorney didn't blink. "Captain Monroe, were you aware that Officer Harkins falsely arrested an FBI agent based solely on race?" Monroe swallowed hard. "I was informed afterward." "Did you attempt to suppress or alter the reporting of this incident?" "No, I—" The attorney slid a printed email onto the table, a copy of the internal correspondence Marcus had retrieved. Captain Monroe stared at it, the color draining from her face. "The record shows you instructed subordinates to manage perceptions and to minimize exposure regarding the wrongful arrest of Marcus Davis. Is that correct?" She opened her mouth, closed it, nodded. Somewhere behind the glass, Marcus watched quietly, arms crossed. She wasn't just falling. She was crumbling. Next came Officer Brian Harkins. His deposition lasted even less. Within minutes, faced with irrefutable body cam footage and official complaint records, Harkins folded. His defense disintegrated into weak justifications and broken sentences. I thought he was suspicious. Suspicious because he was reading a book? He looked at me funny, like he didn't belong there. The federal attorney leaned forward. Officer Harkins, do you believe that simply looking at you a certain way is probable cause for arrest? Silence. The camera captured every second of his collapse. No tricks. No spins. No misunderstandings. Only the undeniable truth. By the end of the week, the federal report was drafted. Its language was brutal in its clarity. Systematic disregard for civil rights. Culture of racial profiling normalized within command structure. Leadership failed to act despite repeated warnings. Retaliatory actions initiated against complainants. The recommendations were clear. Immediate suspension of Captain Monroe pending termination proceedings. Termination of Officer Brian Harkins without pension. Mandatory external federal oversight of Riverside Precinct for a minimum of 5 years. The system that once shielded them was now sharpening its knives, not to protect, but to punish. And all the while, Marcus Davis remained silent. Unmoved. Unflinching. Because he understood something they never had. Power built on injustice is never permanent. And when it collapses completely. 3 weeks later, the Riverside Precinct stood stripped bare. Captain Elaine Monroe's office door was locked, a piece of yellow tape crisscrossed over the entrance. Her nameplate had been removed without ceremony, her 28-year career reduced to a footnote in an investigation report few would ever read in full. Officer Brian Harkins didn't even make it to his termination hearing. He resigned in disgrace 2 days earlier, pension revoked, certification flagged, unemployable in any law enforcement agency nationwide. His file now carried the one mark that no shield could erase: unfit for duty, conduct violations. And Marcus? He didn't celebrate. There were no press conferences, no flashing cameras, no viral speeches. Just a quiet walk back into Riverside Park, the sun low on the horizon, the air cool against his skin. He sat on the same weathered bench where it had all begun. This time, no officers circled him. No suspicious eyes tracked his every movement. Children played nearby. An elderly couple strolled past, hand in hand. Somewhere, a dog barked at a squirrel. Marcus opened a book and rested it on his knees, the soft rustle of pages filling the silence. He hadn't won a war. He hadn't fixed a broken system. But he had carved out a space, a piece of ground that, for now, belonged to him. A space where one black man could sit in peace without fear of being treated like a criminal for simply existing. That, in itself, was victory. Not because it changed the world, but because it changed his. He stayed until the sun dipped below the trees, the sky bruising purple and gold. Then he closed his book, stood slowly, and walked away, leaving the bench behind for someone else to find. The final words from the federal report echoed softly in his mind as he disappeared into the evening streets. Justice is not the product of noise. It is the product of endurance. And Marcus Davis had endured. On his own terms, in his own way, until the end. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire action and hope.